I never thought I'd be standing in my own kitchen, staring at birthday cake crumbs scattered across my worn linoleum floor, wondering how I became so invisible in my own life. My name is Martha. I'm 55 years old, and today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to matter. For 3 weeks, I had been preparing for this moment like it was Christmas morning, and my wedding day rolled into one. My daughter Sarah hadn't visited in 2 years, not since she married that man, David, who looks at me like I'm something unpleasant he stepped in. But when she called last month and said she wanted to come for my birthday, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long: hope. I spent my grocery money on ingredients for her favorite chocolate cake, the one I used to make when she was little and would climb onto the kitchen counter to help me mix the batter. I cleaned every corner of this small house until my arthritis screamed in protest, polished the silverware my mother left me, and even bought new curtains, cheerful yellow ones that made the living room look brighter, more welcoming. I wanted everything to be perfect. The morning of my birthday, I woke up at 5:30, not because I had to, but because excitement had been building in my chest like a bird trying to escape a cage. I put on my best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the one I wore to Sarah's graduation, and spent extra time on my makeup, covering the age spots and trying to make myself look like the mother she might remember fondly, instead of the burden I'd apparently become. I arranged the living room furniture 3 different ways before settling on a configuration that encouraged conversation, that said, "Family gathers here." I set the dining table with the good china, the plates that only came out for special occasions, and placed fresh flowers from my neighbor's garden as a centerpiece. Everything had to be right. Everything had to show her that I was still someone worth loving. When Sarah's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, I watched from behind the yellow curtains as she sat in the passenger seat for a long moment, talking to David. Even from a distance, I could see her shoulders tense, could see him gesturing toward my house with what looked like disdain. My stomach clenched, but I pushed the feeling away. She was here. After 2 years of polite but distant phone calls, she was actually here. I opened the front door before they could knock, my face already arranged in the brightest smile I could manage. "Sarah, you made it," I said, reaching out to hug her. But she stepped back slightly, just enough to make my arms feel foolish hanging in the air between us. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice carrying the tone she might use with a stranger asking for directions. David stood behind her, checking his phone with deliberate disinterest, as if my front porch was the last place on earth he wanted to be. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment to let us know what city you're watching from. I had invited a few neighbors, hoping to create the kind of warm, family atmosphere I remembered from my own childhood birthdays. Mrs. Peterson from next door came with a small potted plant, and the Johnsons from across the street brought homemade cookies. These were people who had watched Sarah grow up, who remembered when she used to ride her bicycle in circles on the sidewalk and sell lemonade from a card table every summer. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice things that made my chest feel tight and hollow. The way David would roll his eyes when I spoke, as if everything I said was either obvious or irrelevant. How Sarah would change the subject whenever I tried to ask about her life, her job, whether she was happy. The way she kept checking her watch, as if she was calculating exactly how long she needed to stay before politeness allowed her to leave. When I brought out the appetizers I'd spent hours preparing, little sandwiches cut into triangles, deviled eggs arranged on my mother's serving platter, David picked at them with obvious reluctance and muttered something to Sarah about processed meat that made her laugh in a way that felt like betrayal. "Mom always did love her mayonnaise," Sarah said, loud enough for everyone to hear, and there was something in her tone that made it sound like an accusation rather than a fond memory. I had been preparing for this moment all day, all week, all month. The birthday cake sat in the kitchen, 3 layers of chocolate with vanilla frosting, decorated with pink roses I'd spent an hour practicing until they looked perfect. 55 candles waited in a small box, ready to transform this dessert into a celebration, into proof that another year of my life was worth acknowledging. But when I suggested we move to the cake, when I started to stand up from my chair with the excitement that had been building all afternoon, David's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger exactly, It was worse than that. It was contempt, cold and complete and devastating in its certainty. "Actually, Martha," he said, using my first name with a familiarity that felt like mockery, "before we get to dessert, I think there are some things that need to be said." Something in his tone made the room go quiet. Mrs. Peterson stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with Sarah. The Johnsons looked up from their plates with the alertness of people who sensed that pleasant social afternoon was about to transform into something else entirely. And in that moment, sitting in my living room surrounded by people I'd hoped would help me celebrate another year of life, I realized I had made a terrible miscalculation. I had assumed that blood meant something, that history counted for something, that love could survive anything if you just held on long enough. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. The silence stretched between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross, and somewhere deep in my chest, that bird of hope began to beat its wings against my ribs, desperate to escape before it was too late. "The thing is," David continued, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had rehearsed this moment, "Sarah and I have been talking about this situation for months now, and we think it's time for some honesty." I felt my hands grip the arms of my chair, my knuckles going white against the faded fabric. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, each second marking the countdown to something I wasn't prepared for. "What situation?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah shifted in her seat, avoiding my eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, like she'd been practicing these words too. "Mom, you have to understand that we're trying to build our own life now. We're saving for a house, planning for children, making real progress. And," she paused, glancing at David, who nodded encouragingly, "and we can't keep pretending that your problems aren't affecting us." "My problems?" The words came out smaller than I'd intended, like air escaping from a punctured balloon. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees in a gesture that might have seemed caring if his eyes hadn't been so cold. "Sarah's been supporting you financially for 3 years now, Martha. The little loans that never get paid back, the sudden emergencies that always need immediate attention, the guilt trips when we try to set boundaries." I stared at my daughter, waiting for her to correct him, to explain that the money she'd given me wasn't charity but help, the way families help each other through difficult times. When my hours at the department store got cut, when the car needed repairs I couldn't afford, when the heating bill in January was more than my entire paycheck, she had offered. I never asked. She offered. But Sarah was looking at her hands, picking at her manicured fingernails, and I realized with a sinking heart that she wasn't going to correct anything. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should—" "No, please stay," David said, his tone suddenly warm and reasonable, like a man who wanted witnesses to his reasonableness. "This affects the whole community, really. We all need to understand what's happening here." The neighbors exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, but uncertain whether leaving would make things worse. I wanted to tell them to go, to spare themselves from whatever was coming, but my voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. "The truth is," Sarah said, finally looking up at me, and I saw something in her face that I'd never seen before, a kind of resigned disgust that made my stomach lurch. "You've become a burden, Mom." There, I said it. Someone had to. The word hung in the air like smoke, filling my lungs until I couldn't breathe properly. Burden. After 25 years of single motherhood, of working double shifts to pay for her dance lessons and soccer uniforms and college textbooks, of sacrificing every dream I'd ever had so she could have chances I never did, I had become a burden. "I worked 3 jobs to raise you," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. "I never remarried because I wanted to focus on you. I gave up everything. And you never let me forget it," Sarah snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "Do you have any idea what it's like growing up with that kind of pressure? Knowing that your mother gave up her entire life for you? Do you know how guilty that makes a person feel?" David placed his hand on her knee, a gesture of support that felt like a performance for our audience. "Sarah's been in therapy for 2 years, trying to work through the codependency issues that your parenting style created." Codependency issues. The clinical term made everything I'd done as a mother, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of putting her needs before my own. Sound like a psychological disorder instead of love. I loved you, I said. And even as the words left my mouth, I realized I was speaking in past tense. Love isn't supposed to feel like a debt, Sarah replied. Love isn't supposed to come with strings attached and guilt trips and constant reminders of how much you gave up. The Johnsons were looking at their plates, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Mrs. Peterson kept glancing toward the door like she was calculating her escape route. But I was trapped in my own living room, pinned to my chair by words that were reshaping my entire understanding of the past 25 years. Sarah. I tried one more time, reaching toward her with one trembling hand. You're my daughter. You're all I have. And that's when David smiled. Actually smiled, like I'd just proven his point better than any argument could have. See? He said to the room at large, as if addressing a jury. This is exactly what we're talking about. The manipulation, the emotional dependency. You're all I have. Do you hear that? That's not healthy parental love. That's possession. Sarah nodded along, her expression growing firmer with each word he spoke. David's right, Mom. You never encouraged me to have independence. You never dated or made friends or built a life of your own. You just focused everything on me. And now you expect me to take care of you forever. I felt something breaking inside my chest. Not cleanly like a bone snapping, but slowly, like old wood warping under too much weight. These weren't strangers criticizing me. This was my daughter, the person I'd loved more than my own life, telling me that my love had been wrong, selfish, damaging. I began, then stopped. What had I thought? That love was enough? That sacrifice meant something? That the person you raised would remember your devotion with gratitude instead of resentment? The cake, I said suddenly, desperately, clinging to the one piece of this day that was supposed to be about celebration instead of destruction. Can we just... The cake is ready. It's your favorite. Triple chocolate with vanilla frosting, just like when you were little. The silence that followed felt different from the others, heavier, more final. David stood up slowly, deliberately, and I watched with growing horror as he walked toward the kitchen where my birthday cake sat waiting, innocent and perfect, decorated with 55 candles I'd been planning to light with such hope just minutes ago. This cake, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, this cake is the perfect metaphor for this entire situation. I followed David into the kitchen on unsteady legs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. Behind me, I could hear the scraping of chairs as the neighbors and Sarah trailed after us, drawn by the terrible magnetism of impending disaster. My cake sat on the counter where I'd placed it that morning with such pride. 3 layers of chocolate perfection, each one baked with the kind of careful attention I'd once given to everything in Sarah's life. The vanilla frosting was smooth as silk, decorated with delicate pink roses that had taken me 40 minutes to pipe just right. 55 unlit candles waited in their small box beside it, ready to transform this dessert into a celebration. You see this? David said, gesturing at my cake like it was evidence in a criminal trial. This represents everything that's wrong with Martha's approach to relationships. It's excessive, it's desperate, and it's designed to create obligation rather than genuine appreciation. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. How could something made with love, something that had brought me such joy to create, be twisted into proof of my character flaws? David, please, I whispered, but he wasn't finished. 55 candles, Martha? Really? You're not a child. This isn't about celebrating. This is about demanding attention, forcing people to acknowledge you, making them feel guilty if they don't participate in your emotional theater. Sarah crossed her arms, nodding along with his analysis. It's like when I was 16 and you threw me that surprise birthday party even though I told you I just wanted to go to dinner with friends. You never listened to what I actually wanted. You just did what made you feel like a good mother. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's 16th birthday. I had worked overtime for 2 months to pay for that party. I'd decorated the basement with streamers in her favorite colors, made a playlist of all the songs she loved, invited 20 of her classmates. When she came home from school and saw what I'd done, she didn't smile. She didn't thank me. She just looked tired and said, "Oh, Mom, I told you I didn't want a big deal." But I'd thought she was just being modest, that secretly she'd be thrilled. I'd thought she'd remember it forever as proof of how much I loved her. "I wanted to make you happy," I said, my voice barely audible. "No," Sarah said firmly. "You wanted to feel needed. There's a difference." David picked up the cake server I'd placed carefully beside the cake, the silver one that had been my wedding gift 27 years ago. "This cake is just like that party. Just like every surprise you've ever planned. Every favor you've ever done without being asked. It's not about love. It's about control." He held the server above my cake like a sword, and I realized with growing horror what he was about to do. "David, no," I breathed, reaching toward him with both hands. "Please. I worked so hard." "Exactly," he said triumphantly. "You worked hard at something nobody asked for, and now you expect us to be grateful for your martyrdom. You expect us to act like this matters because you put effort into it." The room went completely silent. Mrs. Peterson's hand was pressed against her mouth. The Johnsons looked like they were witnessing a car accident. Sarah stood with her arms still crossed, watching her husband prepare to destroy my birthday cake with the detached interest of someone observing a scientific experiment. "This is what happens when you try to buy love with guilt," David said, and brought the server down hard, slicing through the top layer of my cake and sending chunks of chocolate and frosting scattering across the counter. But he wasn't done. As I watched in paralyzed horror, he lifted the entire ruined cake and, with deliberate slowness, turned it upside down over the kitchen floor. The 3 layers collapsed in a cascade of chocolate crumbs and vanilla frosting. The pink roses I'd worked so carefully to create now just smears of color against the worn linoleum. "There," he said, brushing his hands together with satisfaction. "That's what I think of your manipulation tactics." I dropped to my knees without thinking, my hands reaching toward the ruined cake as if I could somehow gather it back together, make it whole again. The frosting was already soaking into the cracks between the floor tiles, and pieces of chocolate cake clung to my fingers as I tried desperately to salvage something, anything, from this disaster. "Get up, Mom," Sarah said from somewhere above me, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "You're making a scene." But I couldn't get up. I couldn't stop trying to save my cake, even though I knew it was ruined beyond repair. This wasn't just about dessert. This was about the last symbol of my hope, the physical representation of everything I'd believed about this day, about my relationship with my daughter, about my worth as a human being. "Look at her," David said to the room, his voice filled with disgusted amazement. "Look at this pathetic display. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation she's been using on Sarah her entire life." I looked up at my daughter through tears I didn't remember starting to cry. She was staring down at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but something worse. Shame. She was ashamed of me. "You disgusting old hag," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Can't you see how embarrassing you are? Can't you see that this is exactly why nobody wants to be around you anymore?" The neighbors gasped audibly. Mrs. Peterson made a small sound of shock. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Get up off the floor and stop making this about you. Everything is always about you, isn't it, Mom? Your sacrifices, your hard work, your feelings." "What about my feelings? What about how it feels to have a mother who never learned how to have a normal relationship with another human being?" I stayed on my knees in the ruins of my birthday cake, staring up at this stranger who looked like my daughter, but spoke with David's words, David's contempt, David's cruel certainty that I deserved this humiliation. Around me, frosting continued to seep into the floor, and I realized that no amount of scrubbing would ever completely remove these stains, just like no amount of love would ever be enough to bridge the gap between the mother I thought I'd been and the burden my daughter believed me to be. The clock on the wall kept ticking, marking the seconds of what was supposed to be my birthday celebration, now transformed into the moment I finally understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones most capable of destroying you completely. The silence that followed Sarah's words felt like death itself had entered my kitchen. I remained on my knees among the cake ruins, my hands sticky with frosting and shame, while the weight of what had just happened settled over me like a burial shroud. Mrs. Peterson was the first to move. I heard her footsteps backing toward the door, then her voice, small and uncertain. I think I should go home now." The front door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house. The Johnsons followed without a word, their earlier warmth replaced by the careful neutrality of people who'd witnessed something they wished they could unsee. Their cookies sat abandoned on my coffee table, a reminder of the kindness that had existed just an hour ago, before my world collapsed. And then it was just the three of us. Me on the floor, Sarah standing over me with her arms crossed, and David leaning against my counter with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. "I think we've made our point," David said, checking his expensive watch. "We should probably get going. We have dinner reservations at 7. Dinner reservations. They had dinner reservations on my birthday, reservations that clearly didn't include me. The casual mention felt like another slap, another reminder of how completely I'd been excluded from their real life. Sarah picked up her purse from the counter, stepping carefully around the cake debris. "I hope you understand now, Mom. We can't keep doing this. The constant drama, the guilt trips, the way you make everything about your needs, it has to stop." I tried to speak, to say something that might bridge the chasm that had opened between us. But no words came. What was there to say? That I loved her? She'd already explained why that was wrong? That I'd sacrificed everything for her? She'd already told me that was manipulation, that she was breaking my heart? She'd made it clear that my heart was my own problem to solve. "We'll be in touch," David added, like he was concluding a business meeting. "When you're ready to have adult conversations about boundaries and realistic expectations, we can try again." And then they were gone, leaving me alone on my kitchen floor surrounded by the ruins of what was supposed to be a celebration. The house felt impossibly quiet without their voices, even though those voices had brought me nothing but pain. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling in cake and frosting, staring at the yellow curtains I'd bought specially for this day. They looked foolish now, aggressively cheerful in a room that had been stripped of all joy. Everything looked foolish. The good china still set hopefully on the dining room table, the fresh flowers wilting in their vase, the birthday decorations I'd hung with such excitement that morning. Eventually, my knees began to ache against the hard floor, and I forced myself to stand. My hands were covered in chocolate and vanilla frosting, sticky and sweet, and somehow obscene in the aftermath of such cruelty. I walked to the sink like a sleepwalker, washing the evidence from my fingers while staring out the window at Mrs. Peterson's house. Her kitchen light was on, and I could see her moving around, probably telling her husband what she'd witnessed. By tomorrow, the whole neighborhood would know that Martha's birthday party had ended with her daughter calling her a disgusting old hag, and her son-in-law destroying her cake. The humiliation felt infinite, spreading outward like ripples in a poisoned pond. I cleaned up the cake mess with methodical precision, scraping frosting from between floor tiles and wiping chocolate smears from cabinet doors. Each motion felt automatic, disconnected from conscious thought, as if my body had decided to function independently while my mind tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. The cake box went in the trash, along with the unused candles and the matches I'd set aside for lighting them. 55 years old, and nobody had lit a single candle for me. Nobody had sung happy birthday. Nobody had made a wish come true. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't want, staring at the spot where my cake had fallen. I'd scrubbed the floor until my hands were raw, but I could still see the ghost of the stain, the shadow of destroyed sweetness that would probably never completely disappear. The phone didn't ring. No one called to check if I was okay, to apologize for what they'd witnessed, to wish me a happy birthday despite the disaster. I was completely, utterly alone in a way I'd never experienced before. Not when my husband left, not during the hardest years of single motherhood, not even during my parents' funerals. This loneliness was different because it was chosen. Sarah had looked at me, evaluated my worth, and decided I wasn't enough. Worse, she'd decided I was too much, too needy, too loving, too devoted. The very qualities I'd thought made me a good mother had been revealed as character flaws, evidence of some fundamental brokenness in my ability to love correctly. I tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I tried to be angry, but the anger felt hollow and forced. Instead, I just sat in my kitchen as the house settled around me, listening to the familiar sounds of a home that no longer felt like home because it contained only me. Around midnight, I walked through the rooms I'd cleaned so carefully for Sarah's visit. The dining room with its hopeful place settings, now looking like the remnants of a party no one attended. The living room with its rearranged furniture, positioned to encourage conversations that had turned into accusations. My bedroom, where I'd laid out my best dress and practiced my smile in the mirror. All of it had been preparation for love that didn't exist, for a relationship that had been dead longer than I'd been willing to admit. I'd been performing motherhood for an audience that had already left the theater, but as I stood in my bedroom, looking at my reflection in the same mirror where I'd practiced smiling that morning, something stirred in the deepest part of my chest. Not hope. I wasn't ready for hope yet. Not anger. That would come later. Something quieter, but more durable. Something that whispered, "You are still here. You survived this. You are still here." The woman in the mirror looked older than 55, worn down by disappointment and cruelty, but she was standing upright. She had cleaned the mess, washed her hands, made herself tea. She had endured the worst birthday of her life and was still breathing. I touched the mirror with one fingertip, tracing the outline of my face like I was meeting myself for the first time. "Happy birthday, Martha," I whispered to my reflection. "You made it through another year." It wasn't much of a celebration, but it was mine. And for the first time in hours, that felt like something I could build on. The days after my birthday blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in 3 years, and spent my time moving through my house like a ghost haunting her own life. But on the 4th day, something shifted. I was standing in my kitchen, making my morning coffee, when I noticed the light coming through those yellow curtains I'd bought for Sarah's visit. The way the sun hit the fabric created patterns on the wall, dancing shapes that changed as the breeze moved the curtains back and forth. I'd lived in this house for 12 years and never noticed how beautiful that light could be. That's when I realized I'd been looking at everything through someone else's eyes for so long, I'd forgotten how to see with my own. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and really looked around. The house wasn't the embarrassing hovel Sarah and David had made it seem. It was clean, organized, filled with things I'd chosen because they brought me comfort. The furniture might not be expensive, but every piece had a story. The armchair where I'd read countless books on quiet evenings. The lamp I'd found at a garage sale and restored myself. The photographs on the mantelpiece, not just of Sarah, but of friends from work, neighbors who'd become family. Moments of joy I'd forgotten in the aftermath of that terrible day. I picked up one photograph I hadn't looked at in years. Me and my coworker Janet at the company Christmas party last year. Both of us laughing at something that had struck us as hilarious after a long week. In the picture, I looked happy. Really happy. Not the desperate, anxious happiness I'd been chasing with Sarah, but genuine contentment. When had I stopped seeing myself the way Janet saw me? When had I started believing that my worth was determined entirely by whether my daughter approved of me? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Janet's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in days, I felt something that wasn't pain. "Martha, honey, where have you been?" Janet's voice was warm with concern. "You missed 3 days of work without calling, which isn't like you at all. Are you okay?" I almost lied. The old Martha would have made up some story about a minor illness, would have protected everyone from the messiness of her real emotions. But sitting there in my kitchen, looking at the photograph of 2 women who'd found reasons to laugh together, I heard myself telling the truth. My birthday was a disaster, Janet. Sarah came to visit, and everything fell apart. Oh, sweetheart. What happened? So I told her. All of it. The careful preparations, the growing tension, the cake on the floor, Sarah's cruel words. As I spoke, I watched Janet's face in the photograph, remembering how she'd always listened without judgment, how she'd never made me feel foolish for caring too much about things that mattered to me. "Martha," Janet said when I finished, her voice fierce with an anger I hadn't heard from anyone in days. "That's not love. What they did to you, that's not how people treat someone they love." The words hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on trying to understand what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a mother, that I hadn't stopped to consider whether Sarah and David's behavior had been wrong, whether they had failed me. But David said I was manipulative. I protested weakly. Sarah said I never listened to what she really wanted. Bullshit, Janet interrupted, using language she rarely employed. Martha, I've known you for 8 years. You're the least manipulative person I've ever met. You're generous to a fault. You remember everyone's birthday. You always ask about people's families and actually listen to the answers. You brought homemade soup to my house when I had pneumonia, and you stayed to help with my laundry even though I told you not to. I felt tears starting, but they were different from the tears I'd cried that terrible night. These weren't tears of shame or self-pity. These were tears of recognition, of remembering who I was beyond my role as Sarah's disappointing mother. You want to know what I think? Janet continued. I think your daughter married someone who doesn't like the competition. Someone who needed to make you the villain so he could be the hero who saved her from her codependent mother. The word codependent sounded different coming from Janet. Not like a clinical diagnosis, but like the manipulation tactic it had been. But what if they're right? I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me. What if I did love her wrong? Martha, listen to me carefully, Janet said, her voice gentler now. There is no wrong way to love your child, as long as that love comes from your heart and not from your ego. Did you sacrifice for Sarah because you wanted to control her, or because you wanted her to have opportunities you never had? I wanted her to have everything, I whispered. And did you expect her to give up her dreams to take care of you in return? No. God, no. I wanted her to be free to live her own life. Then you loved her right, Martha. You loved her the best way you knew how. And if that's not good enough for her now, that's her loss, not your failure. After Janet hung up, promising to bring dinner by after work, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about love and sacrifice and the difference between giving and giving up yourself. I thought about my mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep our family fed after my father died. She'd never questioned whether she was doing it right. She just did what needed to be done, with love and determination and the quiet strength that women like us inherited along with our grandmother's wedding rings and our father's stubborn chins. I thought about the women at work who juggled demanding schedules and difficult customers and still found energy to ask about each other's children, to cover shifts when someone was sick, to celebrate small victories together. We were all love in action, all sacrifice in service of something larger than ourselves. I walked to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept my most precious possessions. My mother's jewelry box, the letters my grandmother had written to her sister during the war, the program from Sarah's high school graduation, where my name was listed among the parents being thanked for their unwavering support and endless love. Endless love. That's what I'd given, and that's what I'd been punished for giving. I pulled out a small leather journal I'd bought years ago but never used, thinking I wasn't the kind of person who had interesting enough thoughts to write down. Now I realized I'd been wrong about that too. I opened to the first page and wrote, "Today I remembered who I am beyond who my daughter says I am." It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't revenge or even the desire to prove them wrong. It was something quieter but more dangerous. Self-recognition. The slow, steady awakening of a woman who'd been sleeping inside someone else's story for too long. I had things to say. I had a life to reclaim. And for the first time since that terrible birthday, I was curious about what came next. Not eager, not hopeful yet, but curious. And curiosity, I was beginning to understand, was the first step toward becoming dangerous in all the right ways. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to notice things I'd been too desperate to see before. Small things that painted a very different picture of my relationship with Sarah than the one David had presented at my birthday massacre. I found myself going through old phone records, not out of obsession, but out of curiosity. Who had been calling whom all these months? The pattern was clear and devastating in its simplicity. I had called Sarah 47 times in the past 3 months. She had called me twice. Once to ask for the recipe for my chicken casserole for a dinner party she was hosting, and once to tell me she'd be visiting for my birthday. Even then, even when she'd called about my birthday, she hadn't asked what I wanted to do or how I'd like to celebrate. She'd simply announced she was coming, and I'd been so grateful for the crumbs of her attention that I'd built an entire feast of hope around them. I pulled out every card I'd sent her in the past year. Birthday, Valentine's Day, Easter, Just thinking of you notes with funny stories from work or pictures I'd seen that reminded me of her childhood. 23 cards and letters, each one carefully chosen, personally written, mailed with stamps I could barely afford on my department store salary. The cards she'd sent me sat in their own small pile. A generic birthday card signed Love, Sarah and David, with no personal message, and a Christmas card with a photo of the two of them on some expensive vacation I'd never heard about until I saw the picture. This wasn't the behavior of a daughter overwhelmed by her mother's neediness. This was the behavior of someone who'd been pulling away for years while allowing me to chase after her, who'd been content to receive my love without reciprocating it. Janet brought dinner every night that first week, and we ate together at my kitchen table, talking about everything except Sarah and David. Instead, we talked about work, about the books we were reading, about Janet's grown sons who called her every Sunday, and included her in their holiday plans without being asked. It wasn't perfect, no family was, but it was respectful, loving, reciprocal. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Janet said one evening, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "That time last year when you used all your vacation days to help Sarah move into her new apartment." I remembered. Sarah had called, stressed and overwhelmed, saying the movers had canceled at the last minute and she and David couldn't handle everything alone. I'd taken 3 days off work, unpaid days I couldn't afford, and drove 4 hours to spend my weekend packing boxes and cleaning her old place until midnight. "She didn't even thank you," Janet continued. "I remember you telling me that David complained the whole time about how you were folding his shirts wrong, and Sarah kept sighing like having your help was more trouble than it was worth." "I thought they were just stressed," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I realized how hollow they sounded. "Honey, when my son needed help moving, he and his wife spent weeks coordinating with me to find dates that worked for everyone. They arranged for childcare so I wouldn't have to worry about my grandkids while we worked. They ordered pizza for everyone who helped, and his wife sent me home with leftover flowers from the boxes we'd packed. That's what gratitude looks like." I sat with this information, turning it over in my mind like a stone I'd found on the beach. All these years, I'd been making excuses for Sarah's behavior, explaining away her coldness as stress or busyness, or the natural evolution of a mother-daughter relationship. But Janet was right. There was a difference between growing up and growing cruel. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I called in sick when I wasn't actually sick. Not because I was wallowing in self-pity, but because I had work to do. And it wasn't the kind of work I could accomplish while smiling at customers and folding sweaters. I spent the day going through boxes in my closet, looking for things I'd forgotten I had. Letters Sarah had written me from college, back when she still signed them. "Love always, your daughter Sarah." School projects she'd made that I'd saved, including a Mother's Day card from 2nd grade that said, "My mom is the best because she works hard to take care of me and she makes really good pancakes." I found photographs too, hundreds of them, documenting years of love in action. Me at every school play, every soccer game, every dance recital. Sarah opening Christmas presents I'd saved for months to buy. The two of us at her college graduation, both of us crying with joy. Her wedding day, where I'd spent my entire savings account on her dress because she'd fallen in love with it, and David had said it wasn't in their budget. Looking at these photographs, I saw something Sarah and David had tried to erase from history. Evidence of a mother and daughter who'd genuinely loved each other, who'd shared joy and pride and affection. Whatever had changed, it hadn't been my fault alone. But I also found something else in that box, something I'd forgotten about completely. A letter Sarah had written me 3 years ago, just after she'd started dating David. In it, she'd thanked me for teaching her independence, for showing her that a woman could take care of herself and her family, for being the strongest person I know. I sat on my bedroom floor, holding this letter, and felt something cold and certain settle in my chest. This letter proved that Sarah's current narrative about my supposed codependency was revisionist history. She hadn't always seen my love as manipulation. She hadn't always felt burdened by my devotion. Something, or someone, had changed her mind about who I was and what my love had meant. I thought about David's performance at my birthday party, the way he'd spoken like he was addressing an audience, the careful way he'd positioned himself as Sarah's savior and me as her oppressor. I remembered his smile when I'd reached for Sarah and said, "You're all I have." Like he'd been waiting for exactly that moment, that perfect demonstration of the point he'd been wanting to make. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my journal and wrote down everything I could remember about David's behavior during the relationship. How he'd gradually discouraged Sarah from visiting me alone, always finding reasons why he needed to come along, or why the visit needed to be cut short. How he'd started making subtle comments about my house, my cooking, my conversations, training Sarah to see me through his critical eyes. How he'd isolated her from her childhood friends too, always having scheduling conflicts when they planned gatherings, always having opinions about why her old friends weren't good enough for the new life he was building with her. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. Right now, I was something more dangerous than angry. I was clear. Clear about what had happened, clear about who was responsible, and clear about what needed to happen next. I opened my phone and scrolled to Sarah's number. For 2 weeks, I'd been hoping she would call to apologize, to explain, to somehow repair the damage that had been done. But sitting there with the evidence of our real history spread across my table, I realized I didn't want her apology anymore. I wanted something bigger than that. I wanted the truth to be told, and I wanted consequences for the people who tried to rewrite my life into a story where love was pathology and sacrifice was manipulation. I didn't call her, not yet, but I put her name at the top of a blank page in my journal and began to write down exactly what I was going to say when I was ready. And for the first time in 2 weeks, I smiled. 3 weeks after my birthday disaster, Sarah called. Not to apologize. I'd stopped expecting that, but because she needed something. She always called when she needed something. "Mom, I have a huge favor to ask," she said without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she'd already decided I would say yes because I always said yes. "David's parents are coming to town next weekend, and our refrigerator just broke. We need somewhere to host Sunday dinner for 8 people, and your house has that big dining room table." I listened to her explain what she needed: my house, my cooking, my hospitality, while she simultaneously made it clear that this was an inconvenience she was asking me to solve, not an opportunity for us to spend time together or repair our relationship. "David's mom is very particular about presentation," Sarah continued, "so we'll need the good china, and maybe you could make that roast recipe you used to do. And we'll need you to serve and clean up afterward, of course, since it's your house and we'll be entertaining. Serve and clean up, like hired help, like someone whose function was to provide a venue and labor for her convenience, not like a mother being invited to meet her son-in-law's family." "What time would you like me to have everything ready?" I asked, my voice steady. "Oh, around 2 o'clock. And Mom? Please don't try to join the conversation too much during dinner. David's parents are very sophisticated and—" She paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to say I would embarrass her. "Well, you know how you sometimes tell those long stories about work and people they don't know?" I knew exactly what she meant. She meant I shouldn't act like a person with thoughts and experiences worth sharing. I should be invisible labor, not a human being deserving of inclusion. "I understand perfectly," I said. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation. Then I opened my journal and wrote, "Today I learned the difference between being needed and being used." I spent that week preparing, but not in the way Sarah expected. I cleaned my house until it gleamed, polished the good silver, pressed the linen napkins. I planned a menu that would showcase every cooking skill I'd developed over 30 years of feeding my family. I even bought flowers for the table, expensive ones, the kind I usually told myself were an unnecessary luxury. But I also made other preparations. I wrote a letter, not angry, not accusatory, just truthful. I gathered the photographs, the cards, the evidence of our real history, and I invited some guests of my own. Sunday morning arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind of day that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully, not in my best dress this time, but in the outfit I felt most confident wearing. A simple blouse and slacks that fit well and made me look competent and self-possessed. Sarah and David arrived at 1:30 with his parents, a distinguished-looking couple in their 70s who introduced themselves as Margaret and Charles Brennan. They were polite but reserved, clearly prepared to endure an afternoon with David's mother-in-law rather than enjoy it. "What a lovely home," Margaret said, looking around my living room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating other people's domestic arrangements. "Thank you," I replied. "I've lived here for 12 years. It's been a good place to build memories." David shot me a warning look, probably remembering his lecture about my tendency toward emotional manipulation, but I simply smiled and offered to take everyone's coats. The roast was perfect, tender and seasoned exactly right, accompanied by roasted vegetables and homemade rolls that filled the house with warmth and comfort. I'd set the dining room table with my mother's china and crystal, creating the kind of elegant presentation that Margaret Brennan clearly appreciated. As we ate, I listened to David and Sarah perform their roles as the successful young couple, talking about their careers and their future plans and their sophisticated social circle. David dominated the conversation, as usual, while Sarah nodded along and occasionally offered supporting details that made them both sound more impressive. "Sarah's mother was just telling us about her work at the department store," Margaret said during a lull, clearly trying to be polite by including me. "Oh, that," David said dismissively. "Martha's been there forever. Same job, same position. Some people are comfortable with limited ambitions." The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah didn't contradict him or defend me. She just looked down at her plate, letting her husband insult her mother in front of his parents. But I didn't react the way they expected. I didn't shrink or apologize or change the subject. Instead, I looked directly at David and smiled. "You're absolutely right," I said. "I have been at the same job for 18 years. It's given me the stability to put Sarah through college debt-free and help her get established in her career. I'm proud of that consistency." Charles Brennan looked interested for the first time all afternoon. "You put her through college yourself?" "Every penny," I said, still smiling. "I worked double shifts for 4 years so she could focus on her studies instead of worrying about student loans." Margaret and Charles exchanged glances. They were educated people, old enough to understand the sacrifice that represented, even if their son and daughter-in-law had apparently forgotten. That's when my doorbell rang. "Excuse me," I said, rising from my chair. "That must be the other guests I invited." Sarah looked up sharply. "Other guests? Mom, what are you talking about?" I opened the front door to Janet, who was dressed beautifully and carrying a bouquet of flowers. Behind her were 2 other women from work, Linda and Patricia, both of whom had known Sarah since she was a teenager. "I hope we're not too early," Janet said warmly, loud enough for everyone in the dining room to hear. "We're so excited to see Sarah again and meet David's family." I led them into the dining room, where Sarah was staring at me with growing alarm, and David looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet some very dear friends of mine," I said, my voice steady and gracious. "Janet, Linda, and Patricia have been part of my life for years, and they've heard so much about Sarah and David." Janet stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who'd been briefed on the situation and was ready to handle it. "Sarah, honey, you look beautiful. And David, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Martha talks about you both constantly." "She certainly does," Linda added, settling into one of the extra chairs I'd set up. "We hear about every success, every promotion, every happy moment. Your mother is so proud of both of you." I watched David's face as this information sank in. These weren't the bitter, resentful co-workers of a woman with no life outside her work. These were successful, articulate women who clearly cared about me and thought well of me. Women who'd been hearing stories about Sarah and David that painted them in a very positive light, because that's how I'd always talked about them, even after they'd started treating me badly. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice tight with warning. "What are you doing?" I sat back down at the head of my table, in my house, where I was hosting a dinner I'd prepared with my own hands, and looked at my daughter with complete calm. "I'm having dinner with people who matter to me," I said simply. "All of them." And then I began to tell the truth, not cruelly, not vindictively, but clearly and completely, with witnesses who could verify every word. I reached into the sideboard behind my chair and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Not dramatically, not with flourish, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "You know," I said, addressing the table but looking directly at Margaret and Charles, 3 weeks ago, at my 55th birthday party, Sarah and David helped me understand something important about myself. Sarah's face went pale. David tried to interrupt, but I continued speaking with the calm authority of a woman who had finally found her voice. They explained that my love had been selfish, that my sacrifices had been manipulative, that my devotion had been unhealthy. I opened the folder and pulled out Sarah's letter from 3 years ago. So I thought you might be interested in hearing what Sarah wrote to me before she met David, when she still remembered who we used to be to each other. I began to read, "Dear Mom, I know I don't tell you enough how grateful I am for everything you've done for me. You taught me that a woman can be strong and independent, that she can take care of herself and her family, that love means action, not just words. You are the strongest person I know, and I hope someday to be half the woman you are." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret Brennan was looking at Sarah with new interest, while Charles had stopped eating entirely and was studying David with the sharp attention of a man reassessing a situation. That's taken out of context," David said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Is it?" I asked mildly. I pulled out more letters, more photographs. Here's Sarah at 18, writing from college. "Mom, thank you for working so hard to make this possible. I know you're sacrificing so I can be here, and I promise to make it worth it." And here's one from her wedding day. "I couldn't ask for a better mother or a better example of how to love unconditionally." Janet leaned forward, her voice warm but pointed. "Martha, remember when Sarah called you about her apartment deposit? You took out a loan to help her because she didn't want to ask David's parents for money." "That's enough," David snapped. But Linda was already speaking. "And when she needed references for her job applications, you gave her our supervisor's number because you knew he'd give her a glowing recommendation based on what a good daughter you'd raised." Patricia smiled at Sarah, but there was steel behind it. "Your mother used to show us your pictures. Tell us about your achievements. She was so proud when you got that promotion. She called us from the store that day, almost crying with joy." I watched Sarah's face as the weight of testimony accumulated. These weren't my desperate claims or biased memories. These were independent witnesses confirming that her mother had been loving, supportive, proud, and generous for years. "The truth is," I continued, my voice steady and calm, "I did love you unconditionally, Sarah. I still do. But what happened 3 weeks ago taught me the difference between unconditional love and unconditional acceptance of poor treatment." I looked at David, and for the first time in years, I wasn't intimidated by his presence or his opinions. "You destroyed my birthday cake and called it a metaphor for my manipulation. But that cake represented hours of work done with joy, anticipation of celebration, and hope for connection. If that's manipulation, then every act of love in the world is suspect." Margaret Brennan set down her fork and looked directly at her son. "David, is this true? Did you actually destroy this woman's birthday cake?" David's face flushed red. "Mom, you don't understand the dynamics." "I understand perfectly," Charles said quietly. "I understand that you destroyed something your mother-in-law made with love, and then you made her feel ashamed for being hurt by it." Sarah finally found her voice. "You're making it sound worse than it was." "Am I?" I interrupted gently. I pulled out my phone log. "Sarah, in the past 3 months, I called you 47 times. You called me twice. Once for a recipe, once to tell me you were coming for my birthday. Does that sound like the behavior of a manipulative mother who won't let her daughter have independence?" The silence stretched on. I could see Sarah processing this information, perhaps for the first time really understanding the imbalance in our relationship. "And when you needed help moving, I used all my vacation days and paid for gas I couldn't afford to drive 4 hours to help you. When you needed a reference, I vouched for your character. When you needed money, I found a way to provide it. If that's what you call manipulation, then I'm guilty as charged." I stood up from my chair and walked to where Sarah sat, looking smaller than I'd seen her since she was a child. "But I'm done now," I said, not unkindly. "I'm done chasing after love that comes with conditions and criticism. I'm done apologizing for caring too much, for sacrificing too willingly, for loving too completely." But I placed my hand gently on her shoulder, and she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. The first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all afternoon. I will always love you, Sarah, but I will never again accept being treated as if that love is a burden rather than a gift. Margaret Brennan was the first to speak. Martha, would you mind if I asked you about that roast recipe? It's absolutely delicious. And just like that, the conversation shifted. For the next hour, we talked about cooking, about work, about books and travel and life. Sarah sat quietly, occasionally glancing at me with something that looked like recognition. David excused himself early, claiming he didn't feel well. As the evening wound down and people prepared to leave, Margaret approached me in the kitchen where I was beginning to clean up. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. We came here today with preconceptions. David had told us that you were demanding, that you made Sarah feel guilty for having her own life. I continued washing dishes, letting her speak. But what I saw today was a gracious hostess, a loyal friend, and a mother who raised a daughter with excellent manners and good values. Whatever problems exist in your relationship aren't from too much love, they're from too little gratitude. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway as her mother-in-law spoke. She'd been crying and her makeup was smudged, but she looked more like my daughter than she had in years. Mom, she said softly, I think we need to talk. Really talk, without David telling us what everything means. I dried my hands and turned to face her. I'd like that, I said. When you're ready. 3 months later, Sarah came to see me alone. She'd been going to therapy. Real therapy. Not the kind designed to make her see me as the problem. She was learning about manipulation and gaslighting, and the way abusive people isolate their victims from support systems. She wasn't ready to leave David. That would take more time and courage than she had just yet. But she was ready to remember who she'd been before he taught her to see her mother as the enemy. We sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and talking carefully, like people learning to trust each other again. The conversation wasn't perfect. There were still hurts to heal, still patterns to unlearn. But it was honest, and it was ours. I'm sorry, she said as she was leaving, the words heavy with everything they couldn't yet fully express. I know, I said, hugging her goodbye. I love you too. That night, I sat in my living room with Janet, looking at the photographs still spread on my coffee table. Evidence of a love that had been real and good and worthy, no matter what anyone else had tried to make it seem. I'd learned something important in those terrible weeks after my birthday. The people who truly love you don't require you to make yourself smaller to earn their affection. They don't ask you to apologize for caring, to hide your devotion, to pretend your sacrifices don't matter. And most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop accepting their cruelty, to force them to see themselves clearly by refusing to be invisible anymore. I picked up my journal and wrote, Today, I remembered that love is not the same as surrender, and that standing up for yourself is not the opposite of kindness. It had taken 55 years and one destroyed birthday cake, but I'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being diminished in love's name. And that, I thought, was worth celebrating.